Hello fellow introverts and welcome back to the channel. Let me introduce you to John Howard Willman, otherwise known as the motherfucker that raped and murdered my great-grandmother. The following statements were obtained from John Howard Willman between July 13th, 1963 and August 31, 1963. These statements were instrumental for the prosecution during the trials of 1964 and 1968, forming the basis of the case against Willman. Obtained from the original court transcripts when entered into evidence, Willman's statements are reproduced here to the public for the first time. Willman's first statement, obtained by detectives on July 13, 1963, regards the attack on Davida Boyard, taken at the Detective Bureau of the City of Erie Police Department, and it reads as follows. Erie Police Department, Erie, Pennsylvania, at 11:50 p.m., July 13, 1963. By Captain Carl Kalinowski of the Erie Police Department, in the presence of Detective Sergeant Charles McCurdy, also of the Erie Police Department. What is your name? John H. Willman. Where do you live? 452 East 8th Street. How old are you? 36 years old. Can you read and write? I can read, but I'm not too good at writing. Are you willing to make a statement of what you know about the assault of Davida Logan Boyer about 3 a.m. on July 6, 1963, on East Front Street, between Holland and German Street? Yes. After I've explained to you, anything you say here can and will be used against you should this case come up in court of law at a later date. Are you still willing to make this statement? Yes. Now, John H. Willman, in your own words, explain to me just what took place. I went to the Tally Hole Bar at 18th and State about 6:30 p.m. on Friday, July 5th, 1963. Then I started to drink beer. I was alone. After I was there a while, I met a stock car driver from Busty, New York, and we had a few beers, and then I offered to buy a lady a drink. She accepted. After I bought her a drink, we sat down in a booth. Then I bought her some more drinks, and then we danced a few times. The lady asked me for a ride home, and I told her I would give her a ride home. I had the truck of my employer, the Mutch Produce Company, parked by the Tally Hole Bar. She got in the truck, and then I drove us toward the lake. We parked there, and she tried to get out to the door, but I pulled her back. We both fell out of the cab. Her glasses fell off her face, and her teeth came out of her mouth, and I fell on top of her. The lady ran to the house. Before she left, she told me to get out of here. I got home. I got home some way, but I don't remember how. John, I show you have a green visor cap. Is that yours? Yes. How have you been treated since you've been arrested? Good. It was the afternoon of July 5th, 1963, when 52-year-old Davida Boyer decided to visit the Erie Public Library in search of a new book to read. Boyer browsed the aisles, grabbing several books before leaving at 5:30 to head back home. Walking south on State Street, Davida window shopped until she reached the southeast corner of East 18th and State Streets, where she entered the Tally Ho Bar around 6:30. A frequent customer at the bar, Davida indulged in substantial amounts of alcohol into the early morning hours of July 6th. Sometime around 1:45, Davida returned to her booth after dancing, plopping down next to her stack of library books. She settled back in her seat, the weight of the alcohol pushed against her with tremendous force. "Come on, get out. Closing," yelled the bartender. "I wonder who's going to walk me home tonight," Davida said loudly, looking around. "I'll drive you home in my car," a low, soft voice responded. She turned around and saw a man with sad eyes, wearing a brown sweater and pants. Smoke escaped from his lips as he inhaled from a cigarette, speaking politely in a slow, lonely voice. Davina eyed a dark cat with ear flaps next to the open can of beer in front of the man. "You will? Good." Davina nodded, reaching for her library books. The man stood up without saying a word, making his way towards the exit. Davina soon followed and exited the bar. Outside is where she was greeted by the man who stood next to an older pickup truck with black siding. "Here it is," the man motioned, flickering the cigarette to the ground as he walked to the front and climbed in the driver's seat. Davida, unimpressed, yet thankful for the ride home. The alcohol made her feel as if weights were attached to her feet, and she crouched into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut. The pickup sputtered to life and pulled away from the curb, turning left down East 18th Street. For Davida, the world outside felt like a blur, as her face was pressed against crisp windows, her eyes watching the intersections of French Street as they approached it. Davita's head twisted, her eyes trained on the intersection as the truck continued through the intersection instead of turning. "Hey, I don't live this way," she protested, pointing behind her. "I live up French." "Come on," the man calmly responded. "We're going to get another drink." "I can't get no drink at this time in the morning, and I've had enough," Davida argued, her hand primed on the door handle. The truck's engine roared as the man's foot pressed the accelerator. "Come on, please take me home," Davida pleaded. Her pleas were met with silence as the truck bolted through the dark streets. Minutes later, she spotted the bay in the distance. the water glistening under the moon. The truck then came to a stop on East Front Street, overlooking the Penelec substation, humming with activity, its lights burning into the night. The man placed the vehicle in park and turned off the ignition. He exited the truck and walked to the passenger door, jerking the door open. Davina braced herself against the door with her left arm. "Hey, what's going on here?" she yelled. The man grabbed her by her arm, throwing her to the ground onto her knees. Before she could react, the man had his arm hooked around her neck. Davita's feet slid against the pavement. She struggled to fight her attacker. Opening her mouth, Davita attempted to scream, but it was stifled by her attacker jamming his hand forcefully into her throat. Her neck burned with pain as she wrestled back. The world around her started to fade away, but just as she was about to black out, he removed his fingers, clutched by her jaw, and yanked out the lower plate of her false teeth. Davita broke loose before the man attacked again, plucking her glasses from her face. "Oh, please, sir, don't break them," Davita replied. "I can't see without them." The man stood still and silent, like a predator watching his wounded prey, waiting for the final strike. He threw Davita's glasses and false teeth aside and grabbed her again, this time with his left arm, bent her over backwards, and reaching underneath her dress, with his right hand grabbed at Davina's underwear, ripping them away. He slammed her onto the ground, diving on top of her. "I murdered one woman for a fuck," he growled, his cheeks quivering with anger. "Now come on." Determined, Davita broke free again, this time pushing her attacker off her. Her feet scuffled against the ground as she regained her footing, now several feet away from her attacker. "What's the matter with you?" she gasped for air. The man's face became flushed with embarrassment, like a small child being lectured. He stuttered, stepping forward. "Come on," his voice trailed off almost innocently. "You pig," Davita screamed, startling her attacker. "You didn't have to ask for it like an animal. You could have asked for it like a gentleman and might have got." The man stood there dumbfounded as Davita brushed off the dirt and grass from her dress. She decided to make a run for it. District Attorney Richard Scarpitti pulled into the driveway of 4625 Homeland Boulevard in the early mornings of the hours of July 14, 1963. After spending a night out with his wife, Phyllis, Scarpitti parked his vehicle. He spotted a police cruiser idling in front of his home. He knew something was happening. As he approached, the officer in the cruiser told him we needed to call the station and speak with Captain Kalinowski. He was informed that an arrest had been made in the attack of Davita Boyer. Kalinowski had told Scarpitti about women's admission to murdering Laura Mutch. "Well then, take him to the scene and see if he recognizes it or doesn't recognize it, and I'll check in with you." Scarpitti told Kowalski not to delay in bringing charges for the assault of Davita Boyer. Any statements abstained needed to be authentic and admissible, which would correlate with just how soon Willman could be charged based on the strength of the evidence. Make sure he's charged properly. At City Hall, Willman was proving a difficult challenge for detectives. Detective McCurdy, Deputy Chief Miller, and Captain Kalinowski led Willman to Miller's office and placed him in the Detective Bureau's car. The group left City Hall, traveling eastbound on East 7th Street until they reached Parade Street, where the car turned right, proceeding south until they reached the corner of East 8th and Parade Street, where the vehicle stopped. The purpose of the trip, see if the detectives could try a different angle to obtain additional information from Willman about what happened the night Laura Mutch was murdered. Detectives asked Willman for additional details, hoping the error would jog his memory. Willman remained silent, looking out the windows. The car sputtered forward another block, this time stopping across from Huck's Cafe. Here, police exited the vehicle with Willman and walked to the corner of 8th and Parade Street, where they turned left, walking west. Along the same route they believed Laura Mutch walked before her death. They reached the corner of East 8th and Holland Street, under a towering brick building. Willman remained silent, shuffling along with the detectives, and the field trip failed to yield any new clues. Soon, the men walked back to the car and returned to City Hall between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Willman was again questioned for about an hour before he was placed in a cell for the night, and an exhausted Detective McCurdy headed home. When Willman was brought in for questioning, detectives searched records within the department for possible prior records. First, nothing indicated Willman hadn't been involved in any major crimes, and he had never been photographed or fingerprinted. Willman was, however, arrested for minor incidents in 1956. 1958. On July 29, 1958, Willman, then 31, was arrested with Julia Bird Hall and Fred Alvin Hall by Detective Lewis Penman of the State Police. The three had been involved in a thieving scheme in Presque Park. On July 25, 1958, the scheme consisted of Julia Bird Hall walking along the beach, a towel in hand. Dropping the towel over an unattended purse, Hall walked away, holding the purse concealed by the towel. The theft did not go unnoticed, and almost immediately, the purse's owner, Helena Clark, followed Hall and wrote down the license plate of Hall's vehicle before it left. She then contacted police, who arrested the three the following day. After Willman was placed in a cell, Kalinowski drove out to the Lawrence Park Police Department, where he spoke with Sergeant Strong. He provided Strong with an update about Willman's arrest and subsequent confession in the Laura Mutch case. Curiosity and concern caused Kalinowski to question Strong about the 1956 arrest and whether he remembered the incident. "Yes, I remember the incident very well," Sergeant Strong replied, an odd look washing over his face. "I was on patrol in the park late one afternoon, just before Christmas, when I came across this fellow. He was sitting in a parked car in a secluded area near a children's playground. On the seat next to him were a pair of trousers and a pair of women's panties and other lingerie. After I took him in for questioning, we discovered that he was wearing women's underwear beneath his own clothes." The following 4 pages contains Willman's second statement, obtained by detectives on July 14, 1963, regarding the Laura Mutch murder, taken at the Detective Bureau of the City of Erie Police Department. Statement of John Willman, age 36, truck driver of 452 East 8th Street, taken at the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, Erie Police Department, Erie, Pennsylvania, at 11:30 p.m., July 14th, 1963, by Detective Sergeant Charles McCurdy of the Erie Police Department, in the presence of Detective Sergeant Melvin Swanson, also of the Erie Police Department. "What is your name?" "John Howard Willman." "Where do you live?" 452 East 8th Street. "Can you read and write?" "Yes." "How old are you?" 36. "Are you willing to make a statement of what you know about the murder of Laura Mutch that took place December 30th, 1960? At 717 Holland Street in the city of Erie, Pennsylvania?" "Yes." "After I have explained to you that anything you say here can and will be used against you should this case come up in court of law at a later date, are you still willing to make this statement?" "Yes." "Now, John H. Willman, in your own words, explain to me what took place." "I think I was at Huck's drinking. From there I walked and met a woman, Mrs. Mutch, and then we walked, and she didn't tell me where she lived, and then we came to this house, and then we went between the buildings to the backyard, and then she fell on the ice and her scarf fell off. Then I grabbed her and put her scarf around her mouth so she wouldn't struggle. Then she was unconscious, and then I pulled down her stockings, and then I pulled down her pants, and then I pulled the scarf out of her mouth. Then I went home." "John, what did you do with the scarf after you took it out of her mouth?" "Put it in the front yard." "John, how do you know this lady that you left in the yard at the rear of 717 Holland Street was Mrs. Laura Mutch?" "I read it in the paper the next day." "John, would you say that Mrs. Mutch was an older woman or a young girl?" "I would say an older woman." "Would you say she was 30 years old or 50 years old?" 50. "John, why are you telling us about the murder now?" "Because it was on my mind." "Why didn't you tell the police about it the next day when you read about it in the paper?" "Because I was scared." "John, did you know that Laura Mutch was dead when you left the yard?" "No." "John, are you sure that you're telling the truth and not making up a story?" "Yes, I am telling the truth." "John, did the woman have the Bible?" "Yes." "John, what did you and Laura Mutch talk about when you walked with her?" "She talked about religion." "John, do you remember passing any people on the street where you walked with Laura Mutch?" "No, I don't remember passing any people on the street." "John, did you at any time hear a dog barking?" "Yes." "Was this after you and Laura Mutch was in the backyard on 717 Holland that you heard the dog barking?" "Yes." "Is this statement of 2 pages the truth?" "Yes." "How have you been treated since your arrest?" "Good. You have made this 2-page statement with your own free will, without the use of force, fear, threats, or promises." "Yes." "Have you read this statement before signing it?" "The defendant's own handwriting." "Yes." "Signature, John H. Willman. Witness, Detective Sergeant Melvin Swanson. Detective Sergeant Charles McCurdy." Now this is the second police interview regarding Laura Mutch, taken on August 31st, 1963. The majority of it is the same, but slightly differs. It goes as following. "Now, John H. Willman, in your own words, explain to me what took place." "I was drinking at Huck's place. Then I started to walk home. I met this woman, Mrs. Mutch. She passed me as I was walking. I then followed her. She talked to me. She talked about religion. Then she said she wanted someone to walk her home. She didn't tell me where she lived. Then we walked and we came to this house. Then we went between the buildings in the backyard. She fell on the ice. And then I went down on my knees. And then I put the scarf in her mouth so she couldn't breathe. And then I pulled down her pants. Then I went home." "How do you know this woman that you left in the yard at 717 Holland was Laura Mutch?" "I don't remember." "John, would you say that Mrs. Mutch was an older woman or a young girl?" "Older woman." Now the next part, you're going to hear Musey, Mutch, Munch. They're all from the same family. So when my great-grandfather immigrated to the States from northern Italy, he couldn't get work because he had an Italian name, so he had to abbreviate it, change it completely, so he was able to find work. So that in mind, Musey, Mutch. They're all the same. Him and his kids, they all went by different names. So, keep that in mind. It was just past 4 o'clock in the morning on December 31st, 1960, as 40-year-old George Musey stood before the front desk of the Erie Police Department in the basement of City Hall. Outside, a cool breeze rattled the frost-covered windows. Across from him, Detective Sergeant Carl Kalinowski feverishly scribbled back and forth, filling in the missing person reports. He paused, looking up at Musey. "Haven't I seen you before?" He gestured with his pencil. "Weren't you in here only a week ago or so to tell us about another missing person?" "That was my brother, Leonard Mutch, Jr.," Musey mumbled. "And now you want to report your mother missing?" Musey glumly nodded, telling Kowalski that his mother, 60-year-old Laura Mutch, was still grieving the death of her brother Leonard, and as a religious woman had recently found solace in prayer. That night prior, around 7 o'clock, Musey dropped her off at the Full Gospel Tabernacle Church located at 56 East 8th Street, near the corner of Ash Street. Before driving away, Musey attempted to get his mother to accept his ride home, but she declined, preferring to walk instead. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Musey received a phone call telling him his mother never returned home. Hastily dressing himself, Musey walked to his parents' house at 615 Holland Street. From there, he and his brother Andrew searched the neighborhood for their mother. It was only after speaking to the pastor at the Full Gospel Tabernacle Church, the Reverend Richard J. Gibson, that the family decided to file a missing persons report. Musey described his mother as heavy-set with graying hair, blue eyes. When he last saw her, she was wearing a heavy pink overcoat over a navy blue dress. Her head was covered in a flower-patterned scarf. Kowalski looked over the report. Having been with the department for the past 5 years, he knew it was not out of the ordinary to receive missing persons reports such as this. There was, however, a peculiarity about the report that nagged at him. Next, Kalinowski placed a call to Detective Captain Armand Chimenti. This year, 1960, was drawing to a close, and the detectives were kept busy investigating dozens of burglaries, purse snatching, and assaults in the city's east side neighborhoods. If you're local, some things never change, unfortunately. He watched Musey shuffle out of the department and hoped George Musey's mother would be found, and soon. A cold front continued to hammer the lakeshore, and the temperatures had dipped below zero when Detective Sergeant Chester Wizakowski, Raymond J. Lappens were tasked with searching for Laura Mutch. The pair traversed several different routes Mutch could have taken traveling her way home. As they patrolled the dark streets and alleys around East 8th Street, the detectives also ventured into nearby all-night restaurants and diners, thinking Mutch may have had an accident or wandered in for a late-night coffee. But they came up empty-handed. As the crisp wind howled and the dark blue sky gave way to the morning twilight on the horizon, the detectives were unable to locate any trace of Laura Mutch. She had simply vanished. Hours later, just before 9 o'clock in the morning, 37-year-old Charlotte Claw had just finished feeding her children inside their small duplex located on the first floor of 717 Holland Street. Making her way to her bedroom at the rear of the duplex, she tidied up, preparing to leave for an appointment that morning at the Boston store. Raising the shades to her windows, she was met with a grisly sight. Below the window was a body of an elderly woman lying on her back. Hands at her sides, her dress appeared to have been lifted and bunched around her waist. The woman's eyes were open, her mouth slacked wide, and something had been shoved into her mouth. She brushed past her son, rushing to the front door. Turning to her son, as she opened the front door, she slithered her arms into the sleeves of her coat, telling Frank to make sure his sibling stayed inside and not to get near the back of the house. Stepped out into the piercing cold, trudging her way next door to the Muffler King building on 202 East 8th Street, where she told her landlord of the frightening discovery. The landlord immediately phoned the switchboard operator at the police headquarters. At the same time, Charlotte Claw made the gruesome discovery in her backyard. Detective Sergeant Carl Malinowski was sipping his cup of coffee at Jim and Lee's restaurant. Standing just over 6 feet tall, the husky 57-year-old detective was an Erie native. Like most of those in the department, Malinowski had worked as a salesman and a driver for the Erie County Milk Association and often operated a small barbershop from his home. In 1936, he attended the state police school, followed by the FBI school in Erie in 1939. Minutes later, he arrived on the scene, greeted by a small crowd of men and women clustered in front of 717 Holland. Officers Robert Sheridan, officers Paul Miller, and Raymond Pelikowski, having just arrived minutes prior, greeting the detectives, directing them towards the backyard. As the detectives walked along the northern side of the building, their feet crunched against the ice as they entered through the narrow, 3-foot-wide clearance between the duplex and the neighboring garage of the Conzel Construction Company. They rounded the corner. The body came into view underneath a rear bedroom window. Morning frost clung in their nostrils as they inched closer, their own heavy breathing drowned out by the distant barking of the dog in the morning sun. Inspecting the body more closely, they noticed that one of the woman's shoes was partially off, and the other was still on her foot. Her coat was open, and her blue dress underneath pushed up to and around her hips, leaving the victim nude from the waist down. Near her right hand lay a black Bible. 2 feet from the Bible, a pair of woman's glasses, with the right lens broken. It was the whining of sirens that had attracted the attention of George Musey and his brother-in-law as they stood outside 615 Holland Street that morning. As they approached the scene, Musey overheard that the body had been found in the backyard. Approaching one of the nearby patrolmen, Musey mentioned his mother had been reported missing earlier that morning and inquired as to the description of the body. Recognizing Musey, officers placed him and his brother-in-law in the backseat of the police cruiser parked across the street by the No. 2 Jones Elementary School. As the body was removed from the rear of 717 Holland Street, the cruiser was maneuvered into the driveway in front of the garage. Musey and his brother-in-law exited the car where they were shown the body. Musey confirmed that the body was that of his mother's, Laura Mutch. After the body was removed, detectives spotted that the ground underneath it had melted, most likely due to the victim's body heat at the time of death. By 11:30, Dr. Fust had begun his external examination of the body. Fust documented the injuries, which included marks in the skin of the nose, her cheekbones and the cheeks, and of the upper lip, and of the chin showing linear markings. These consisted of red, slightly depressed parallel lines, about 1/16 of an inch apart, and certainly represented impressions or abrasions due to firm contact with clothing having this configuration. There was a 1-inch band-like depression in the skin on the anterior surface of the neck above the Adam's apple. This was taken to have been caused by pressure of the scarf, which was said to have been tightly looped around the neck when the body was found. An examination of the fluid found on the body later confirmed sperm was present. This, according to Dr. Fust, indicated Mutch had either recently had intercourse or had been forcibly raped by her murderer. An internal examination of the organs indicated no signs of pre-existing conditions that would have caused or contributed to her death. There were small hemorrhages noticed in the serious coverings of Mutch's heart, along with dark, unclotted blood in the heart, common indication of asphyxiation due to suffocation or strangulation. Discussing the findings with Coroner Wood, Dr. Fust determined the cause of death was asphyxia, caused by Mutch's scarf being wrapped tightly around her neck. The pressure of the murderer's hands on both her mouth and her nose then cut off her air supply, resulting in her death. The truth, however, was that detectives had very little physical evidence. They were assisted by others within the detective bureau, were able to identify 2 suspects who were arrested and taken into custody. First suspect, a 52-year-old male, possessed a prior record of committing sex offenses against women and had served time in prison for these offenses. He had been out of prison several months when he was picked up by detective. The suspect was also a distant relative of Laura Mutch and lived close to the scene of the murder. He was booked without charges pending and grilled relentlessly by detectives. The suspect, however, denied any knowledge of the involvement of Laura Mutch's murder. The second suspect, 24-year-old, had been arrested in Silver Creek, New York, after running out of gas and stealing an automobile on December 29th. Charged with theft. This suspect was ordered held for a lie detector test as to be scheduled in connection with Mutch's murder investigation. On Monday, February 24, 1964, closing arguments began. The district attorney charging Willman was responsible for Mutch's murder. Attorney Bernard Quinn, meanwhile, argued Willman was not responsible for the murder and that the murderer of Laura Mutch was still at large. If you convict this man, it will be on the basis of this convention alone, because that is all the Commonwealth has, and there is serious doubt that Willman was capable of giving a confession to them, Quinn said to the jury. At 6:40 p.m., the jury panel returned to ask Judge Evans for clarification for the difference between first and second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. Judge Evans took 7 minutes to present the information to the jurors, and they retired again, only return with a verdict an hour and a half later at 8:05 p.m., finding guilty for the murder in first degree. After the verdict, District Attorney Carney asked for mercy for John Willman. Society is quite adequately protecting with the penalty as it is, Carney said. I ask that you spare his life. So back in the 1960s, they still had the death penalty, the electric chair specifically, in Erie County. So they were asking for him to, yes, be convicted, but not be sentenced to death, which, I mean, I have my own thoughts, but it goes on. They appealed the conviction, and then they went back and they had a second trial in 1968. They were able to file an appeal on the basis that some arbitrary findings that the council thought that John Willman was not adequately treated, or was not treated properly during his preliminary incarcerations. During the appeal, they had a second trial. He was found guilty as well, a second time, for the rape and murder of my great-grandmother. So I had kind of known the story, but not all the details. Then I started looking into it, and it was kind of rough, even though I never met her, obviously, because she died in 1960 and I was not born until the 80s. But it is weird to have a personal connection and then never have known your family member, and then the first time you see her is in crime scene photographs. That's kind of weird. Yeah, with that, I'll talk to you nerds later.